Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 5 for PPA 500. Hope your week is off to a good start. This indeed is week 5, and so it means that we are getting closer and closer to the end of our abbreviated term together. We have this Zoom session tonight, and then after tonight, we only have 2 more Zoom sessions. We have a Zoom session for week 6 and one for week 7. And then that's it for our live Zoom sessions. And so we have covered a lot of material, but we still have a lot of material left to cover. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to pick up where we left off last week, and we're going to start with this discussion of public administration as a discipline. And I've kind of hinted here and there about the Woodrow Wilson article from 1887 and its importance in terms of kind of being the jumping off point, if you will, for a discipline of public administration. So we'll talk about that in the first half of class tonight. Then the second half of class, we'll take a look at the evolution of the literature in public administration, kind of hitting the high points of how the public administration literature has dealt with studying and understanding public organizations, because at its very heart, the study of public administration is the study of public organizations. And so by the time we finish our information tonight, you'll then have all the information that you need in order to successfully complete the midterm assessment that we looked at last week. And just as a little segue, as a reminder, that midterm assessment is due on next Tuesday. Again, we moved that due date back to next week just so we could cover this information this evening. So that is due next Tuesday. And then also next week, you have Canvas essay number 4. And Canvas essay number 4 will look at this idea of public administration as a discipline, and will give you the opportunity to use some of the information that we are covering here in the first half of class tonight in order to draw your own conclusion about whether or not you feel that public administration is its own standalone academic discipline. And if it is, why you think it is. If not, then why do you think it is just a subfield within another academic discipline, such as political science? And that's an important topic, so much so that you encounter it not just in Canvas Essay 4, but you're also run into that in the assessment. And the reason why it's such an important topic, because we are all here, or almost all of us are in an MPA program. So it's important for us as students in an MPA program to really have a good sense of what we are studying and how we are studying that phenomena. So I think it's really a very central question to everything that we do in a program such as this. So just to recap, midterm assessment is due next Tuesday by midnight, and then Canvas essay number 4, your initial response to my prompt, and then responses to classmates, also then due by next week. I looked at all the Canvas essay number 3s. They have come in, and I've already reviewed those and provided feedback. So if you posted your essay anytime before about 3 p.m. today, I've had a chance to take a look at it. And again, I think the responses are all very good. They're exactly what I'm looking for. So just keep doing that same type of an approach in Canvas Essay 4 and 5 that you've used on Canvas Essays 1 through 3. So I think that's all of our housekeeping issues before we get going for this evening. Any questions before we jump back into our material? I also realized it was brought to my attention that the recording from last week, for some reason, Canvas ate it. I don't know what Canvas did, but I had posted it after class last Tuesday, and it between last Tuesday and this morning, and somehow it just disappeared from the Canvas site. So I went ahead and re-uploaded it again, and so hopefully it is there now and it's viewable. Sometimes whenever I load a video up, it takes a little bit of time for it to process, but hopefully it's all processed. And so if you want to go back and watch last week's session and what Kelly Janicek talked to us about, that is now available for you on our Canvas site. Canvas does some strange things every now and then that it's above my pay grade to understand all those technical glitches, but if a glitch is going to happen, it always happens with something like that. And so I apologize for that.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
For the midterm assessment, is the formatting also the same as the Canvas essay responses?
Yeah, it's very brief. Brief answers, 1 to 2 paragraphs is fine. And I think it's probably best if you just download that midterm assessment and then just insert your answers right into that document. 1, 2 paragraphs for each of the questions. Make them concise, make them parsimonious. Same type of deal as with the Canvas essays.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get into this discussion of public administration and what we study in public administration, and then kind of broach this issue of whether or not public administration is its own academic discipline. And this whole idea of studying administration separately, coming up with this separate study of administration, traces its roots back to Woodrow Wilson. And we have made mention of Woodrow Wilson a few times already in this class, but his classic article, The Study of Administration from 1887, really advocates for us the importance of studying administration as a neutral instrument, distinct and separate from policy and politics. And so it presents to it this kind of idea of this politics and administration dichotomy. But before we get into the discussion of Wilson and his contributions to public administration, we do have to recognize some of the legacy and the not so attractive legacy of Woodrow Wilson. And that's why one of the articles that I attached on our Canvas site for this week was a book review, actually, of a book that was written analyzing Woodrow Wilson's approach to the federal bureaucracy. And during Wilson's time, we had this movement from an era of spoils to an era of merit, where instead of hiring people based upon which political party they belonged to or which candidate they supported, we began to hire people based upon their knowledge, skills, and their abilities. The idea is to bring these neutral administrators into the bureaucracy so that they could do a more effective and more efficient job. It's kind of all part and parcel of the progressive movement of the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And I know the word progressive is used a lot today, especially in the Democratic Party, but the way in which progressive was used back then is a little bit different than today. Progressive back then was used for like good government, and so it was open up transparency, make government easy for the public to see, let the sun shine in, implement these progressive types of initiatives to try and make government more effective and more efficient. Woodrow Wilson kind of used this whole idea of the progressive movement and this making of the federal bureaucracy based upon merit and qualifications, kind of a subterfuge for some of his racist ideologies. And historians have gone back and kind of reanalyzed Woodrow Wilson and realized that he really, when he was talking about the progressive movement and talking about a neutral administration, he was doing that in some ways to try and segregate the federal workforce. And so he was attempting to segregate the federal workforce and deprive the opportunity of African Americans at the time to have the opportunity to be bureaucrats and work within the federal bureaucracy. And we have kind of a litany of examples of how Woodrow Wilson did not really share our contemporary view of social equity and social justice. And so we do need to make mention of that before we talk about Woodrow Wilson. So he's got his good and he's got his bad. The good part of Woodrow Wilson is that he did really provide us with this framework for studying public administration as its own field of study. And I think that's why some people still refer to Woodrow Wilson as the grandfather of public administration. But a lot of schools of public administration that used to have his name on their buildings have now removed his name. And so schools like Princeton University, they no longer have Woodrow Wilson on the outside of their building for their School of Public and International Affairs. They removed his name in recognition or realization of some of his racist tendencies and some of the ways in which he tried to segregate the federal bureaucracy. But for our purposes here, we do have to acknowledge that Wilson's article did kind of set up this idea of studying administration separately from studying politics. And essentially what Wilson talked about in that article, and the article was assigned, hopefully you had a chance to take a look at it. What he talked about in his article is that if we wanted to make what he called the quote unquote business of government to make the business of government more efficient and more effective, what we needed to do is we needed to pull administration out of the political world and study administration as a field of management separate from politics. And there are several advantages to doing that. One of the advantages that Wilson talks about in his article is if we pull administration out of politics and we study administration separately, what we can then do is we can borrow all of these administrative innovations that were developed by other countries that had different political systems. So the example he uses in the article is civil service. And so he says, we know that England had this very rich history of career civil service for many, many years. We could borrow some of their civil service innovations, things such as the use of examinations to test people to make sure they have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities before hiring them into the bureaucracy. We could come up with a way in which people could join the public administration, join the federal bureaucracy without necessarily needing to work their way up from the bottom. We could borrow some of these things and apply them to our system of government if we take politics out of the equation. And so by doing that, he kind of gave us this idea of studying administration as a separate field of study. This thing that became known as the politics administration dichotomy. So on the politics side of the equation, you've got policy formulation. So you've got those elected officials who are doing the work of passing these laws, putting these policies in place. And then on the administrative side, you have the administrators, the bureaucrats, who then execute and implement those laws. And that was this politics administration dichotomy that he argued for. A lot of students of public administration, after reading the Wilson article, what they will come away with is this politics administration dichotomy, the separation of politics and administration. One caveat that I would add for you is when you read the Wilson article, you'll see that he has this one passage in the article that says politics is a touchstone of administration. And when he calls politics the touchstone of administration, what he is saying is we can borrow administrative innovations from other countries and apply them to our system, but we still have to be mindful of different political cultures. So the one prominent example is, again, the use of examinations. So we can borrow examinations and apply them to our system of civil service. However, the examinations that were used in England were a system of closed examinations. So not everyone had the opportunity to take every examination to apply for any position that they wanted to. Those exams were only closed to certain people with certain educational backgrounds. When we brought that idea of examinations to America, we had a more open political culture in that respect. And so we took this system of closed exams and we transformed them into a system of open examinations, where anyone could sit and take this examination. And if they performed well enough on the examination, they could then qualify for that job in the federal bureaucracy. That's politics serving as a touchstone for administration. So our system of career civil service, which we'll talk a lot more about in a subsequent week, it's not something we just created on our own. We borrowed those innovations from other countries that we modified and tweaked them a little bit to make them better match our unique political culture. So it's just not all about the politics administration dichotomy. And indeed, very early on, as of the 1930s, as we had talked about in a previous class, people started to realize that there really wasn't this clear distinction between politics and administration. We started to realize that administrators were involved in the policy formulation side of the equation. They were kind of bleeding over into the political side. Whenever we have these pieces of legislation that need technical expertise, it's going to be the administrators who are called in to provide that technical expertise, as we had talked about last week. So we came to realize that this politics administration dichotomy is not a clear line of demarcation between the political and the administrative world. And we realized that administrators get involved in policy making. However, when administrators get involved in policy making, their motivations tend to be different than the motivations of elected officials. Elected officials are most concerned about getting reelected. If they don't get reelected, they are no longer elected officials. David Mayhew told us that decades ago in his book, Congress, the Electoral Connection, that members of Congress, their primary motivation is to get reelected. So they end up going out there and advertising their name. They go out there and they take positions on non-controversial issues, and they go out there and they claim credit for very popular types of programs and projects. That's all done to help them get reelected. So they make these policies to help their reelection prospects. Administrators don't have reelection prospects. They get their jobs based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. So hopefully the motivation of administrators in policy formulation is to truly make better policy, and policy that is clearer and easier to implement over on the administrative side of the equation. So just because they play in the political world doesn't mean that they have the same motivation as the elected officials who are making those policies. So Wilson provides to us this idea of a separate study of public administration. And what we have learned over the years, and we have about over 150 years of literature looking at the study of public administration and public organizations, what we have learned is we have learned three different generalizations, according to Don Kettle. The first generalization we have learned is that public administration is timeless, yet it is also time-bound. What Kettle means by this is that public administration is timeless in that there are some theories and some maxims of public administration that are as true today as they may have been 150 years ago. And so, some of those maxims is when you are managing people, if you involve people in decision making, chances are they're going to have more buy-in in the results of those decisions. If you compensate people adequately for their work, that's going to motivate them to work a little bit harder. And so these are maxims that are true regardless of whether you talk about them today or in 1890. So some are very much timeless. However, some of our theories are also time-bound in that these theories we're going to talk about in the second part of class tonight, they are really an artifact of their times. And so if you're looking at something like human resource management theory, which talked about treating employees better and worrying about and being concerned about the development of those human beings as resources and helping them develop their skills. Those types of areas of focus really came about in the 1950s and the 1960s at the same time that we really kind of saw this rise of psychology and this idea that we really need to pay attention to the wants, needs, and desires of individuals. And so these theories are really very much a product of the time in which they were written. So public administration has some timeless theories, but it also is very time-bound. Second generalization, public administration is universal, but it's also culture-bound, and it varies according to the situation. This is my favorite answer of it depends. It depends upon the context of the situation. Public administration is universal. And as we've talked about a couple times already in this class, public administration surrounds us every single day. Every single thing that we do, everything that we touch in our everyday lives is going to be affected by government and by public administration. So it is indeed universal. However, as we administer these policies and programs and organizations, we have to realize that every organization has its own culture and every situation has its own unique context. And so therefore, we have to make sure that we are managing by these situations. So although it's universal, it's also very much contextual as well. And the third generalization, according to Kettle, is that public administration is complex, but it is intelligible only by using simplified models or step-by-step combining of such models. In other words, public administration is extremely complicated. It's extremely complex. In order to understand it, we need to develop theories and models that will help us understand these complicated and complex phenomena. The whole idea of the need to put together theories and models suggests to us public administration as an academic discipline. Because one of the primary elements of an academic discipline is that they have unique phenomena that they study, and they come up with unique ways of studying those phenomena. So we're kind of building toward this whole issue of public administration as an academic discipline. But before we get there, let's kind of zero in on this idea of the complexity and the complication associated with public administration. Another thing that Wilson tells us in his article is that, and he was writing this in 1887, is that the world of public administration, the world of government, was becoming more and more complex with each passing day. Well, if Woodrow Wilson thought that the world was complicated in 1887, imagine what he would think about the world and government today. So we are even much more complicated, much more complex than we were back in Wilson's days. Organization systems are complex, and because of this complexity, we need to develop these models and these theories and kind of deconstruct this complexity into these theories and models that we can then use to understand these complex organizations. Single models, single theories alone are usually not successful at explaining complex situations. As I always say, a complicated problem usually requires a complex solution. It's very, very rare that we'll have a simple solution that will completely eradicate or address a very complex problem. So we're dealing with this complex world of administration. Where does this complexity come from? What makes public administration so complex? Well, there are a lot of factors that contribute to this complexity. One of those factors is the interconnection of policymaking and execution, this bleeding over of those two worlds of policy formulation and policy execution. As those two worlds bleed over into each other, as they cross over into each other, it kind of complicates who does what and what they're supposed to be doing and when they're supposed to be doing it. Makes for a very complex situation. Coordination, the need for coordination. It is very unusual today to have a single program being implemented by a single agency or organization. Typically, public programs and public policies today are implemented by collaborative networks. So when you have all this collaboration going on, the implementation of a policy or program, it requires a lot of coordination, a coordination between all these different organizations within this governing network, between people within these organizations and the governing network. The more coordination that's required, the more complex the management of these organizations and networks will become. Relationships and power. When you have these governing networks and when you have these exchanges between all these organizations and individuals and groups, they're going to form relationships with each other. Whenever we have relationships formed, we know that we are going to have power, and we're going to have the exercise of power. You remember back to our discussion very early on about John Gaventa and his three different types of power: the overt power, the mobilization of bias, and the co-optation. We talked about all those three different phases of power because power is something that's exercised on a daily basis in these relationships in public administration. One organization trying to exert power and influence over another organization, an individual trying to exert power over another individual, a group trying to exert power and influence over another group. So all of these relationships, again, make it a very complex situation to try and understand. Public administration, public organizations are also floating in the seas of time, which means, as we had mentioned on the previous slide, that they're kind of an artifact of their time. And so a theory that may have been very appropriate and would have worked very well in 1920 may not work all that well today. And so we have to take the time context into account. We also have different types of organizations. Some organizations are very hierarchical. They're very much of a top-down structure where you have one person at the top of the organization. Then as you move down the organization, you get kind of this pyramidal shape. That as you move down the organization, you encounter more and more positions so that the plurality of positions are going to be at the bottom of that hierarchical structure. That's a tall hierarchy. A lot of our organizations, our bureaucracies, are tall hierarchies. However, we also have some organizations that are much flatter in terms of their organization structure. Think about something such as a commission. A commission is going to be headed up by maybe 3 or 5 or 7 commissioners. And so you've got all these commissioners who kind of share co-equal power. So there's not just that one person at the apex of the organizational chart. Think about Los Angeles County and the Board of Supervisors. You have five supervisors in Los Angeles County. They are all of equal importance and equal strength, or at least in theory they are. So those are kind of your bottom-up types of organizations as compared to your top-down types of organizations. So we have different organizations, makes it very complex to study those different organizations. Information. And this is a really important one. Today, we have a lot more information that's swirling around us. We have to determine what is credible versus what is not credible information. Lavana, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna ask if you can repeat one more time, like an example of a bottom-up organization, and then also to this point of information, in case you don't get to it, like the best and most like efficient ways to kind of like um, tell if like information is credible or not.
Mhm. Yeah, no, those are both great questions. In terms of bottom up organizations, another good example of something that would be considered a bottom up organization, oftentimes you have a small nonprofit, and that small nonprofit may have a board of directors. And you may have, 3 to 5 members of that board. They all kind of share that power. And so we oftentimes see that bottom up type of approach in that you don't have one person at the top who's giving all the orders and handing those orders down. You really have that power shared across many people in the organization. So it's kind of what we would call a flatter type of hierarchy. And I think we see that a lot in our smaller types of nonprofit organizations. And the information one is a difficult one, especially today. With the rise of social media, there's information everywhere. We are inundated with information. And the question then becomes, how do we know which information is credible, what information is not credible? I actually saw an interview yesterday with Steve Ballmer, who's the president of the LA Clippers, and has the former head of OpenAI and Microsoft, and I think he's worth something like $350 billion or something like that. And he was talking about where he gets his information from. And surprisingly, he said he gets most of his information from X, I guess and we used to be Twitter, but it's now X. He gets most of his information from X, which was kind of surprising. But he says he gets his information from X because he gets it from news outlets that then post that material on X. He also gets it from elected officials who post their material on X. So he's not just getting information from just anyone, he's getting it from what he considers to be credible sources. So the question is, what is a credible source? A credible source, know whether or not it is credible, we have to look at a couple things. One thing we have to look at is we have to look at how they put their information together. This is why peer-reviewed research is so important in the academic world. This is why as you go through the MPA program, you're going to be relying upon, when you do research, on peer-reviewed journal articles. You want to make sure that they are peer-reviewed because those articles, before they get published in that journal, they go through a rigorous review process where they will go to the editor. The editor will then refer them to a panel of 3 to 5 experts in the field. They will then review the article, review the methodology, make sure that it's all methodologically sound and that it makes sense from a theoretical perspective. If they want revisions done, they'll then suggest revisions to the author. The author then has to make those revisions and resubmit. It's an iterative process where those articles may go through 4, 5, 6 revisions before they actually get published in that journal. So when we're looking in the academic world, the way to tell if it's credible is peer review. Another way to determine the credibility of a source is look at who is publishing it and look at their funding sources. So who is paying for this research or for this project to be done? So you go to their website, you look at who are their funders, who's paying for this. And you may find that it's a study that's being done by a think tank, and that think tank is being funded either by all, Republican donors or by all Democratic donors. Well, then you kind of know it's going to have either a very Republican or a very Democratic kind of slant to it and what is being reported. So look at who's doing the work and how those people are being funded, who's paying for that type of research. Those are all good ways to determine what is credible, what is not credible. For the most part, when we're looking at documents that come out of organizations such as the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. The Government Accountability Office does literally hundreds upon hundreds of reports every single year on different policies and different programs and their effectiveness and their efficiency. The Government Accountability Office is usually a pretty good, objective, neutral source of information. So they don't have any type of partisan leaning. They really do some pretty good objective work. So if you're getting something out of the Government Accountability Office, chances are it's going to be pretty accurate. The Census Bureau usually does a pretty good job. Every now and then they have to go back and they have to revise some of their estimates and some of their statistics, but the Census Bureau also tends to do a pretty good job. So if it's something that's coming out of the federal bureaucracy that is not being really colored by partisan affiliations, that's the type of information that we usually look at as being relatively credible. We have to be careful when we see studies coming out of universities to, again, look at the researchers who are doing the work. Is this work peer reviewed? And then if this is grant funded work, who's funding this work? And you want to see where the money's coming from, kind of like in the Watergate, you want to follow the money and you want to see who's funding these projects. And so it's difficult. If you're just going to pull things off of social media, that usually is unvetted information. We don't really know the qualifications of the people who are publishing that information. We can go and double check it and try and replicate their methodology, but sometimes they're not clear whatsoever about what their methodology is. They'll just say, this is what I have found, and just put their findings out there. But if you don't know how they arrived at those findings, there's no way that you can make sure that it's credible. But in our academic world, it really is peer review and using articles out of good peer-reviewed journals. And as we look at these journals to determine, what the quality of journals, there is something that's called an impact factor. And so whenever you're pulling an article out of a journal, every journal will have its own impact factor. And the impact factor basically measures how often that journal is used in other research. So the impact factor is just a really simple ratio where they will look at the number of times that articles in this journal have been cited by other researchers over the past 2 years, divided by the total number of articles in the journal. So if you get like an impact factor of a 2.5, that means that the average article in that journal has been cited, has been referenced 2.5 times by 2.5 other authors. So obviously, the higher the impact factor, the more visible that journal is, the more people are relying upon that journal for doing their own research. That doesn't mean that a journal with a low impact factor is necessarily bad or that you can't rely upon it. Some newer journals sometimes have low impact factors because they're not that well known in the field yet. They're just kind of getting started. And so their impact factor might be a little bit low today, but hopefully in 10 years, that impact factor will be relatively high. In our field in public administration, the highest impact factor is probably going to be for a journal like Public Administration Review, PAR. That's probably going to have the highest impact factor. So that's kind of the granddaddy of them all in terms of peer-reviewed journals in public administration. But with all this information swirling around us, again, we have to determine what's credible, what is not credible, and it adds a lot of complications, adds a lot of complexity to the studying of public administration. Organizations are also sometimes very centralized and decentralized in terms of how they are structured. Some organizations have headquarters where everyone is working together in the same location. Some organizations have field and regional offices spread all over the country. Think about something like the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture literally has dozens upon dozens of field offices spread all across the United States. So if you want to study the Department of Agriculture, it's going to be difficult for you to come up with a conclusion that applies to every single field office within the Department of Agriculture, because each field office probably operates a little bit differently. Each field office probably has its own organization culture, its own set of expectations and norms. So those can be much more difficult to study than a more centralized organization where everyone is together in one physical spot, in one physical headquarters. And then the values that underpin public administration also make it more complicated to study. We know here in public administration, we go beyond just effectiveness and efficiency in terms of what we value. Yes, we value effectiveness, that we are actually accomplishing the goals that we want to accomplish. And next week, we'll get into a little bit more in terms of what makes an organization effective. But for our purposes now, effectiveness, are you accomplishing your goals and objectives? Efficiency, we know, is doing more with less, creating more output with fewer inputs. That's something the private sector focuses on very squarely. We also hope we will be efficient in the public sector, but beyond that, we also have other values such as social equity, with social justice, political responsiveness, protection of individual rights, creation and maintenance of a representative bureaucracy. So we have a lot of values that go beyond just effectiveness and efficiency. The more values you are studying, the more difficult it is to study those organizations. So without belaboring it too much, I think we've kind of established the fact that there is a lot of complicating factors that make public administration really relatively complex and relatively difficult to study. We also know that the reality of public administration, because it is so complex, is rarely able to be explained through abstract theories. Abstract theories oftentimes don't capture all the nuances and the complexity of what's going on in all these different organizations. So our theories need to be a little bit more tangible as opposed to being abstract. If you're in the world of theoretical physics, your theories can be a little bit more abstract, obviously, and let's really ground it in what's happening on a daily basis. In public administration, we have to be much more tangible and much more grounded in our theories and our models. And because the world's so complex in public administration, we know that there is no one single model or theory that applies in every situation. In the second half of class, as we go through our discussion of the evolution of the public administration literature, we will say that one of those threads that we can see that runs through the entire evolution of public administration has been the movement away from looking for a single theory to apply in every situation and recognizing that things are contextual. And then instead of having one magic bullet that applies everywhere, we have to look for theories and models that fit the context of those individual situations. So because of all that complexity, it really does suggest to us that perhaps we need to study public administration, public organizations differently than you would study other types of phenomena, which may suggest to us that public administration may be its own academic discipline. In order to answer that question, we're not going to come up with a definitive answer here. I want you to come up with your own answer, and there's no right or wrong answer about whether public administration is its own academic discipline. But I think before we can really kind of broach that question, we have to understand what an academic discipline is. So we think about a university, you've got all these different academic disciplines. You have history, you have psychology, you have sociology, you have biology, you have chemistry, you have all these different things that call themselves academic disciplines. What makes something an academic discipline? Usually it's uniqueness, that they are studying some type of unique phenomena that is different than the phenomena being studied by other academic disciplines, and that they will apply unique methods and approaches to studying those phenomena. So the way in which you study something in history is going to look a lot different than how you might study something in biology. Just the basic comparison of humanity or social science compared to natural sciences. In biology or chemistry, in the natural sciences, you have much more control over what you are studying. You control your variables. You control the environment, the setting in which that research is being done. In the social sciences, we're usually dealing with human beings. And so human beings can be highly irrational. So we don't have a lot of control over our subjects. We don't have a lot of control over our independent variables. In natural sciences, you can take whatever you're studying, you can put it underneath this hood, you can create a controlled environment and have complete control over that entire environment. We can't really do that in the social sciences. You can't do that in the humanities field like history either. If you're looking at something in the field of history, you are going to use things like a content analysis. So you're going to look at writings that were done hundreds of years ago, and you're going to compare those writings to see what you can glean about the way in which people lived 200 years ago based upon those types of writings. It's a very thematic content type of analysis. If you're in the world of political science, there's a reason why political science is called political science, in that it goes beyond just being government. There is a scientific component to it. So we are going to apply statistics to explain a lot of these political phenomena, to assist our understanding of why this member of Congress voted the way in which they did, or why this bill did not pass, or whatever the case may be. And so it's a much more statistical type of an approach in political science than what you would get over in the world of history. So there is some uniqueness, not just to what we are studying, but also to how we are studying it. Now, here in public administration, what we are typically studying, as we talked about in a previous class session, is we're typically studying public organizations. And we spent a lot of time last week talking about the differences between public and private organizations and what makes public organizations unique. So the question you're going to have to think about as you decide whether or not you think public administration is a discipline is the public sector, are public organizations so uniquely different from private organizations that it justifies an MPA as opposed to an MBA degree? Are we that different so that we have a completely different field of study as compared to what's done over in the world of business? So how unique are the phenomena that we are studying, and then how unique are the methods that we apply to studying those phenomena? Now, in terms of the uniqueness of the methods we use here in public administration, we do borrow a lot of methodologies from other fields. We borrow a lot from political science. A lot of the approaches, whether it be a OLS multiple regression or binary logistic regression, or we borrow those from political science. Sometimes if we're doing some modeling, economic modeling, we're going to borrow things from economics, such as econometrics and some stochastic modeling. So in political science, we in public administration, we borrow some things from political science, we borrow some things from economics in terms of how we actually go about and do our work. We borrow from psychology. So if we're collecting qualitative information, we want to know what someone thinks about something or how they perceive of something. We might put together a focus group, and we might go in and interview that focus group. Well, interviewing a focus group is something they do in the world of psychology. And so we kind of borrowed that method and we applied it to our study of public organizations and public policies. So we do borrow a lot of our methods from other academic disciplines. So just kind of also keep that in mind in terms of whether or not you think public administration truly is an academic discipline. In Canvas essay number 4, this is what you're going to be talking about. Do you believe that public administration is unique enough to qualify it as its own standalone academic discipline, and why or why not? My favorite question is, so what? And again, well, so what? Who cares if public administration is its own discipline? Well, we should care if it's its own discipline because it's really going to dictate how we go about studying what we study in public administration. And there's no right or wrong answer to this. And it's just how well you justify your answer as to whether or not you think it is or not an academic discipline. I did a study last year for an article I did where I looked at MPA programs around the country to see where those MPA programs were located. 46%. And so not a majority, but a plurality of public administration programs, MPA programs, are co-located within departments of political science. So you can do what you want with that type of information. When I went through my PhD program, public administration was one of 4 different comprehensive examination areas. But that's kind of the common arrangement. However, there are public administration programs that are standalone, like we are here at Cal State Long Beach. We're our own department in a completely separate college than the Department of Political Science. I think I had mentioned to you earlier that Willamette University for years actually combined their MBA and their MPA programs together into one degree program. It was completely meshed together into one degree program. When I was at Ohio State, the public administration program was in the College of Business. And so it was just one more graduate program within a bigger College of Business. Now, it's no longer like that. It's its own school now because former Senator, the late John Glenn, gave them a whole lot of money. And so they then created the John Glenn School of Public Affairs, I believe it's called. So they actually divorced themselves from the College of Business. But when I was there, it was just one other program within the College of Business. Here at Long Beach, we're our own independent department, but we are located within a College of Health and Human Services. And that's a relatively unusual arrangement. I think in what I looked at last year, I think there are only like 4 or 5 MPA programs around the country that are located in a College of Health. That's a pretty unusual to see something like that. Sometimes we see public administration co-located with criminal justice. That's a very common type of arrangement. Sometimes we see them co-located with an emergency management services program. Sometimes they're co-located with public health programs and with healthcare management programs. And so there are a lot of different arrangements. And I think that just kind of underscores the fact that there's really no one single way of answering the question of, is public administration a discipline? But I want you to kind of take this information, what we've talked about tonight, and use that to fashion a response to Canvas essay number 4 and what you think about public administration as being its own standalone academic discipline. But whether it's an academic discipline on its own or whether it's a subfield in a larger discipline such as political science, we have developed some theoretical perspectives on how we study administration over the years and how we study public organizations. So what I would like to do now in this part of the class is to kind of take you through the evolution of the literature in public administration with a focus on how we study public organizations and how our approach has changed since the late 1800s. So the way in which we're going to do it is we're going to go through different schools of thought that present to us different ways of studying public organizations. We'll start with the classical school, and you'll see the classical school represented by people like Max Weber on the bottom left, Frederick Taylor, the one in the middle, and then the guy on the right with the impressive facial hair is Luther Gulick. These are just examples of 3 classical organization theorists that really helped to shape the beginning of the study of public organizations and public administration. So we'll start with the classical school, then we'll move to what we call neoclassical schools. And as I mentioned last week when we talked about the midterm assessment, when we're talking neoclassical schools, we're basically just talking about schools of thought and theories that were developed after the classical school, oftentimes as responses to some of the criticisms that were lodged against the classical school. So we'll start with classical school, and then we'll move to some more neoclassical modern approaches. If you've had an undergraduate public administration class before, you're probably familiar with some of these individuals and some of their theories. But when we start our discussion of the classical school, we usually start it with Max Weber. Max Weber is a German, by training, a German sociologist, and writing primarily in the late 1800s. Weber really believed very much in rationality. Weber believed that bureaucratic organizations were the utmost example of rationality, that he believed in rationality when we make our decisions. We should make our decisions based upon fact. We should make our decisions based upon collecting empirical information. And when we say empirical, we mean tangible information. So information that we can collect, information that we can understand, information that we can analyze. So we're going to collect this empirical information and then use this empirical information to then form our opinions and to come up with our answers. He felt that bureaucracies, bureaucratic organizations, were uniquely positioned to do exactly that. They were uniquely positioned to collect this empirical information and then make rational decisions. Weber believed that there was one ideal way in order to structure an organization. So Weber told us when we study our organizations, we need to look at the structure of the organization chart, how the organization has structured itself. And then he told us there is one ideal bureaucratic structure, what I refer to as the ideal bureaucracy. Weber tells us that the ideal bureaucratic organization is one that demonstrates all those characteristics that I have listed there for you on the screen. So the first characteristic is it must demonstrate a tall hierarchy, as we had talked about before. This pyramidal shape, it's supposed to look like a triangle in my camera, but the pyramidal shape, whereby you have one person at the apex of the pyramid, one person in charge of the organization. Then as you go down the organization structure, you then encounter more and more positions until when you get to the bottom of the organization structure, you will then encounter the plurality. That's where most of your positions are at. This very tall type of hierarchy is part of an ideal structure. The second part of an ideal structure is what he calls division of labor. So we divide up the work in our organizations. So some people have certain jobs, other people have other jobs. This is a common feature of almost every bureaucratic organization. Probably in your organization, if you're currently working in a public or nonprofit organization, even in the private sector, you probably have a position description. That position description will describe what your job is and the types of tasks that you do on a daily basis, and probably the percentage of time that you spend on each one of these tasks. That's what's known as specialization of task. So when everyone has their own job, they then specialize in certain tasks on a daily basis. So we have some people who are budget analysts, and so their specialization of task is analyzing budgets. We'll have some people who may be payroll technicians. Their specialization of task is working on payrolls. We'll have some people who may be project managers. So their specialization is working on managing these specific types of projects on a daily basis. When you have people who specialize in specific tasks and do those tasks day in and day out, by nature, they're going to become experts because they're the ones who are doing these jobs most often. So they become experts in what they do, which means our ideal bureaucratic structure is going to be staffed by these experts. In this ideal bureaucratic structure, we also have what's called a chain of command or a unity of command, in that everyone in the structure, everyone in the organization chart knows to whom they are accountable. So you know who your supervisor knows who their supervisor is, and so on up the organizational chart. That's this chain of command, this unity of command. There's also a span of control, meaning that every supervisor is responsible for a set number of employees who are located below them in the organization chart. So you're not going to be responsible for every single person who's below you in the organization. You'll be responsible for perhaps a unit or for a division, a limited number of people. We are going to limit your span of control to make it more manageable for you. These people who are working in the organization, they're not only experts, but they're also professional career employees. These are people who are in this organization for a career. They're not free agents who are going to jump from this organization to another one, to another one. They look at their occupation as being a career type of profession. And we base all of our decisions upon written documentation. Again, it's all empirical information. We're going to write that information down. By writing that information down and documenting it, we then have that information for future generations so that we can treat everyone in an equal, fair manner. So we apply the rules fairly to everyone, irrespective of who that person is, because we rely upon these written rules and regulations. This is why we have policy and procedure manuals in our bureaucratic organizations. This is why we have written strategic plans. This is why we have written code of conduct and code of ethics. So those are what he considers to be the primary characteristics of what he calls the ideal bureaucratic structure. Weber, as a classical theorist, believed that if we could structure all of our organizations in this ideal manner with these characteristics, we can make our organizations efficient and effective. It was very much this silver bullet, this one-size-fits-all approach that will work in every single situation. Our second classical theorist told us, as we studied organizations, rather than looking at the structure like Weber did, Frederick Taylor told us we should instead look at the work processes. He said in order to make our organizations efficient, we need to figure out what he called the one best way to do our jobs. So he said we'll look at all the work processes that are going on in an organization. We will then deconstruct each one of those jobs into its component elements, and we will then come up with what he calls the one best way to do each job in our organization. So the difference between Weber and Taylor, Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked at the processes of work going on within organizations. One of the problems that Weber and Taylor both shared is that they were relatively dehumanizing in the development of their theories. They didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to individual employees. They didn't really care much about the uniqueness of individual employees and the wants, needs, and desires of the employees within organizations. What they were focused on is they were focused on the organization's effectiveness and the organization's efficiency. So Frederick Taylor develops this theory of scientific management. You've probably heard about scientific management before. It was predicated upon the use of what he called these time motion studies. So he would literally, either he or one of his colleagues would position themselves behind an employee as an employee did their job. They would be there with a stopwatch. They would then time every single element of the job, every single movement that that employee took. So the classic example was a very simple job, such as shoveling pig ore. So there's a job that someone would take a shovel, they would take a shovel of pig ore out of the pile of pig ore. They would then move that shovelful over to a cart. They would dump it into the cart. They'd return to the pile and start over again. That was their entire job. So if you do a time motion study of that, you would time the amount of time it took the employee to put their shovel into the pile, the amount of time it took them to pick up a shovelful, the amount of time it took them to go over to the cart, the amount of time it took them to dump the pig ore into the cart, the amount of time it took them to return to the pile and then start over again. So every single one of those elements of the job would be timed. They would then get rid of all what they call the false movements. So any movement that employee was taking that was not contributing to the efficiency of the job, they would eliminate. So for instance, if they had to walk 5 steps to get from the pile of pig ore to the cart, well, maybe we can eliminate that by moving the cart closer. So we've eliminated that false movement, so they're no longer walking to the cart. That's going to make the job a lot more efficient and a lot quicker to get done. So it was those time motion studies they would use for every single position within an organization. They would get rid of all the false movements, take all the efficient movements, combine them together into this one best way to do the job. Scientific management, this period of time, we're talking about primarily the early 1900s, especially the 1920s. In the 1920s, scientific management really ran like wildfire through the private sector. Private corporations were all adopting scientific management and these time motion studies. Public sector organizations saw what was going on in the private sector and said, well, maybe we should start adopting that as well. And so then scientific management started making its way into the public sector. We still see artifacts of scientific management alive and well in public organizations today. Things such as your position description. So your position description that we'd already mentioned will list, here are all the tasks that you are doing on a daily basis. Here's the percentage of time that you are spending on those tasks. Here are the expectations for you to do this job in that one best way. We also created position classification systems. So if you're working as a civil servant, you probably have a position classification in that your position is located someplace in the step and column classification system, which will dictate then your compensation. Another big element of Frederick Taylor is that if people are doing their jobs in the one best way, so they're doing the jobs the way in which they're supposed to be doing their jobs, we will then reward them. So we will have pay for performance. If, however, people are not doing their jobs in the one best way, then we will eliminate that person, we'll pull them out of the organization, and we'll just simply replace them with someone who will do the job in the one best way. According to Taylor, people were just replaceable cogs in the machinery of the organization. So when you think about a machine and you've got all these different cogs and each cog has these teeth on them, the machine operates whenever the cogs turn and the tooth on one cog then pushes on the tooth of another cog, which then turns that cog and so on and so on. If one of your cogs has a broken tooth, then it's not going to make that connection and the entire machinery is going to grind to a halt. So you take that broken cog out, you throw it away, you replace it with a new workable cog. Same type of thing with employees. Taylor, in some of his writings, if you ever read his writings, you'll see that he says things such as employees or people are boorish beasts, that they are basically not very intelligent. They have to be told what to do. It was a very dehumanizing view of individual employees. It was all about making these positions as efficient as possible, which will then in turn make the organization efficient. So taken together, Max Weber and Frederick Taylor share this same characteristic of trying to come up with the one best way to make organizations effective and efficient. Weber said you do it through structure. Taylor said you do it through analyzing these work processes and coming up with the one best way to do a job. Then a third example of a classical theorist is Luther Gulick. And Luther Gulick is a little different than Weber and Taylor for a couple of different reasons. One reason is that Luther Gulick was actually able to take his theories and apply them directly in the federal bureaucracy. Now, Weber's work was primarily theoretical. Taylor's work was primarily done in the private sector, did move its way into the public sector, but was primarily kind of a private sector type of domain. Luther Gulick was a member of this commission known as the Brownlow Commission. And if you are a student of American history, you may be familiar with the Brownlow Commission, and I'll try and type it and talk at the same time. But the Brownlow Commission was a commission that was designed in the early years of the FDR administration to try and reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make it easier for the president to manage. When you think about the first few years of the FDR administration, FDR came in at the height of the Great Depression. So FDR then brought with him his New Deal programs to try and help pull state and local governments and the federal government out of the throes of the Great Depression. The way in which he would do it is the creation of all these different alphabet agencies, WPA and all these other agencies, and then all these other programs that these agencies would then be implementing. So his New Deal led to a vast expansion in the size and the scope of the federal bureaucracy. But we know from our reading of the Constitution, Article 2, that the president is the chief executive. The president is the head of the executive branch. So it became next to impossible for presidents to be able to effectively manage this ever-increasing federal bureaucracy. So the Brownlow Commission was formed to try and come up with a way to reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make it easier for the president to manage. So some of the things the Brownlow Commission did is we ended up with an executive office of the president, where we took management agencies and put them in this one-stop shopping in this executive office of the president to provide the president with a little bit more of a management arm over all these different agencies across the federal government. But as part of some of these Brownlow recommendations, Luther Gulick, as the chair of the Brownlow Commission, actually took some of his theories and incorporated them directly into the public sector. So this is really our first theorist who worked directly with public agencies. And what Luther Gulick developed is what's known as his principal school. And to be fair, he was not the only author who came up with the principal school. When you take organization theory, your 660 course, you'll talk about some other principal theorists such as Fayol and Mooney. But for our limited purposes here, we're going to look at Luther Gulick as kind of this father of the principal school. It's called the principal school because it kind of harkens back to what we talked about with Graham Allison, in that public and private organizations share similar functions. All public and private organizations engage in planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. As Allison tells us, it's not what they do, instead it's how they do it. Gulick felt that if we could teach our managers, our public managers, these skills, how to plan, how to organize, how to staff, how to direct, how to coordinate, how to report, and how to budget, these functions, these generic management functions, would then form kind of a managerial toolkit. And if we could provide this managerial toolkit to our public managers, they could then pull the appropriate tool out at the appropriate time based upon the situation that they were facing. So if they were in a situation where they needed to engage in strategic planning, they would have the planning tool that they could use to help plan the operations of their organization. If they needed to find additional appropriations or some grant money, they could use the budgeting tool and pull that out and use that at that appropriate time. So for Gulick, what he shared with Weber and Taylor is this idea of a one-size-fits-all approach. This is the one managerial toolkit. that every manager needs in every single public organization. So they all share this one-size-fits-all approach. The difference is obviously Gulick was looking at the functions. And if we focus on the functions of government, we focus on the functions of administration, that's how we can make our organizations effective and efficient. Taylor said we focus on work processes. Weber said we focus on structure. So taken together, these three authors kind of make up the school that we refer to as the classical school. And I've kind of shown you their differences, but also the thread that ties them all together, looking at that one-size-fits-all approach with the ultimate goal being the benefit of the organization as opposed to the benefits of individual employees. So that's what we call the classical school. And again, in terms of a chronological period of time, we're talking about late 1800s with Weber up through into the 1930s and early 1940s with Luther Gulick and the principal school. But as we already acknowledge, there were some serious problems associated with the classical school, most notably that we were ignoring employees. We were only focused on the organization. We weren't really focused on the people in that organization that really make that organization function and make that organization go. That was one of the primary criticisms that then gave rise to some of what we call these neoclassical schools of thought. Schools such as the Human Relations School, the Human Resource Management School, the System School, and then some more modern schools such as Quality Management, Organization Culture, Leadership Theories, and some of the more modern theories that we deal with today. So in this neoclassical school, we're going to kind of take it from overlapping at the end of the classical school up to our modern point in public administration. But before we get to that point in time, I think this is probably a good time to take a break since we're right between classical and neoclassical schools. So let's take about a 10-minute break or so. Let's come back at 5:16. And when we come back at 5:16, we'll jump into the Human Relations School and we'll start off with one of my favorite authors, which is Mary Parker Follett. So take about 10 minutes, come on back, and we'll talk neoclassical theories. Okay, it's 5:16, well, actually 5:17, so welcome back. Let's continue our discussion. Again, now we're going to move into these neoclassical schools. And the whole idea of this discussion is just kind of give you an introduction into the public administration literature. And if we are an academic discipline, it means that we're studying unique phenomena and we're developing unique theories, unique models to try and explain those phenomena. And these are just some of those models and theories that have been developed. And just kind of give you this idea of the evolution of how the public administration literature has changed over the years. So we talked about the classical school, and now these neoclassical schools like human relations, human resource management systems, and those modern approaches, they were usually developed as a rejoinder or a response to some of the criticisms that were associated with the classical school. Primary criticism being that the classical school ignored the wants, needs, and desires of individual employees. So let's start with the Human Relations School. Now, in the Human Relations School, for the most part, the Human Relations School, we're looking at 1930s, 1940s, into the 1950s. But one exception to that is this first human relations scholar by the name of Mary Parker Follett. Mary Parker Follett, some people will refer to her as a pre-human relations theorist because she was actually writing in the 1920s at the height of the adoption of scientific management. So when all these public organizations were taking scientific management from the private sector and applying them in the bureaucracy, Mary Parker Follett was kind of the lone voice in the wilderness, someone who was willing to stand up and take issue with Frederick Taylor and scientific management. And you can just understand how difficult that would be to do when you're pretty much the only theorist who's willing to do that. What compounded it and made it even more difficult for Mary Parker Follett is that she was female and she was doing this writing and developing these theories in the 1920s. And so a lot of her contemporaries didn't really pay attention to the theories that she was developing. Some of the later human relations theorists, such as Elton Mayo and Chester Barnard, weren't really aware of the theories that Mary Parker Follett was developing. But 10, 20, sometimes 30 years later, they developed theories that were very similar to what Mary Parker Fall had developed decades earlier. And so she was very much this pioneer in the development of these criticisms of the classical school, most notably criticisms of scientific management. Follett is interesting in that she recommends to us that we need to think about studying public organizations in a similar manner as we study democracies. So she talks about organizations as being kind of mini democracies. She says when we look at a democracy from a kind of political science perspective, we see that there are a couple of flaws in democracies. One flaw of a democracy is what she refers to as the passivity of citizens. That democracies tend to make citizens passive. So when you think about how people usually participate in a democracy, how do you participate in a democracy? What's the most common way in which you participate in a democracy? What do most people do? Well, we hope they would, but not most people. But what's the most common way? Exactly. Yeah, they vote. We've got this big election that's coming up in November. People vote. And the reason why they are much more likely to vote than to engage in any other type of political participation is kind of rational self-interest. People have limited time. And so one of the least costly ways to participate in terms of time is by voting. And that's especially true here in California recently, in that now everyone gets a mail-in ballot. And so you can just sit at your dining room table and you can fill out your ballot. You can drop it in the mail. You can take it to a ballot drop box. You can take it to a vote center. We've made it very, very easy today for people to vote here in California. So because it is so easy, that's the route that most people take to participate. That's a very passive way of participation, much more passive than other forms of participation, such as working on a campaign, doing what we call door knocks, going door to door, knocking on those doors for candidates, running for office yourself. Those are all much more active ways of participating, but democracy kind of pushes people toward being more passive. And in a democracy like what we have, our democratic republic, as we know from our reading of James Madison and Federalist Number 10, our system of a compound republic creates these particularized interests, what James Madison referred to as our factions. And so we naturally end up having these factions. When you have these factions, these particularized interests, they by definition are going to come into conflict with each other. So just like when Madison told us conflict is inherent in a democracy, Follett tells us the same thing. So when you have those particularized interests, they're going to create conflicts. Those conflicts can, if not managed correctly, be then detrimental to a democracy and can then also be detrimental to a democratic organization. She says the ways in which we deal with these two flaws of passive citizens and then the creation of conflict, a couple different ways. One way we can deal with passive citizens, or in the context of an organization, passive employees, is through participation, creating an open communication system, both vertical as well as horizontal communication, whereby people are invited to participate in the decision-making of the organization. The more they participate in the process of making decisions, the more likely they are to buy into and accept those decisions once those decisions have been made. So participation helps us with passivity. In terms of dealing with conflict, she says we have to choose the most appropriate way to deal with conflict. She says there are basically three different ways in which we can deal with conflict. The first way is domination. So this gets us again back to John Gaventa and our three different faces of power. The first approach is domination, which means that one party wins, one party loses. One person wins, one person loses. One dominates over the other. This is kind of your overt power, your mobilization of bias, your co-optation. One dominates over the other. She says that is simply the worst way to deal with conflict, because when you have domination, one party is going to be disappointed, one's going to be disaffected, and they're then not going to buy into the decision that was being made. A little bit better approach is compromise and negotiation, but it's still not ideal, because whenever we compromise and negotiate, you give up something, I give up something, and we come to a negotiated settlement. You're giving up something. I'm giving up something. So neither of us are fully satisfied with the resolution that we are obtaining. So compromise is still not even the most appropriate approach. She says the most appropriate approach to dealing with conflict is integration. Integration occurs where people participate, they share their ideas with each other. Once these ideas are shared with other people, those ideas will then interpenetrate into the opinions and ideas of everyone else. That interpenetration will then lead to what she calls integration, where we'll take all these ideas and we'll assimilate them into the synthesis of a new way of approaching the problem that everyone can accept and everyone can get behind. You cannot have integration and the creation of this new synthesized approach that people can get behind without participation, without listening to people, without involving people in their own self-determination and their own self-governance. So you can see, even though Follett was writing in the 1920s, her theories really push us very far away from the classical theorists and really argue to us that we need to include individual employees in their own self-governance and their own self-determination. Not that same dehumanizing approach that was taken in the classical school. Now, if you're currently working in an organization, you might look at your organization and say, well, just how practical is Mary Parker Follett in her idea of interpenetration and integration? Clearly, there are some practical limitations. If we have to make decisions very, very quickly, we have to respond to a quickly changing environment. It may be difficult for us to have the time to involve everyone in this integration process. And so there are times where we're not really going to be able to integrate everyone's idea. Mary Parker Follett was also known for her theory of situational leadership, where she argued you lead by the situation. So hopefully in an ideal situation, you will be able to get people to participate. You'll be able to engage in interpenetration, integration. But she also recognized that there are some points in time where organizations have to make decisions very quickly. The more people you involve in a decision, the longer it takes to make that decision. I had mentioned earlier about how we govern today through these governing networks, and that's really a very common theme in public administration. One of the negative impacts of governing networks is gridlock, in that once you get all these organizations that are working together in this network, you not only have a lot of organizations, you have a lot of individuals within those organizations. More organizations, more individuals, the slower the decision-making process sometimes becomes. But the importance of Mary Parker Follett is, again, she's moving us away from the classical school and really kind of gives us this segue into this new neoclassical school that's known as human relations, where we recognize that we need to take individual employees into account. Another human relations theorist who wrote about 20 years after Mary Parker Follett is Chester Barnard. As you go ahead in the MPA program, you take future courses, especially 660 organization theory, you'll see that Chester Barnard is littered all over the public organization theory literature for a lot of different types of theories. Here we're looking at him in terms of his contributions to human relations theory. Chester Barnard tells us that in order for public leaders and managers to be effective, they need to get the compliance from their employees. That the success of a manager depends upon the acquiescence and compliance of employees. So essentially what Barnard tells us is it's a transactional relationship. So this is kind of the genesis, if you will, of transactional leadership style, where leaders enter into this transaction with their employees. Leaders need to get contributions from their employees in order to make the organizations effective and efficient. In order to obtain those contributions, what leaders have to do is they have to then provide incentives. They incentivize their employees to then provide contributions. Well, what types of contributions are employees providing? They're providing their time, they're providing their effort, they're providing their expertise and their knowledge. Those are the contributions that organizations need from their employees. What incentives can leaders provide to get those contributions? It depends. My favorite answer. It depends upon the employee. Some employees will favor compensation. And so they'll want monetary compensation, which we're very limited in being able to do in the public sector. Some employees want recognition. They want to be employee of the week or employee of the month. Some want a different title and they want kind of that prestige because they have these esteem needs. They need to be held in high esteem by their colleagues. So different people have different needs that will incentivize them to provide these contributions. It's the job of the leader or manager to understand the needs of their employees and then provide the correct set of incentives to then obtain contributions from those employees. So what Barnard is telling us is we need to know our different employees. We need to know our employees are different and unique from each other. Another kind of contribution that Barnard makes here is we not only need to know our employees in order to know the incentives that will incentivize them, but we also need to know what they value in terms of their ethical standards and their ethical expectations. Barnard argues that when you ask an employee to take a certain course of action and to provide a certain type of contribution, you need to ask them to do things that do not violate their ethical principles. Barnard says that every individual employee has their own unique zone of indifference. The zone of indifference is when you ask someone to do something that does not violate their ethical principles, you are operating within their zone of indifference, and they're not going to push back on that request. They're going to acquiesce to it. It's not a big deal. It's not violating their ethics, and so they're probably going to go along with it. However, if you ask them to do something that falls outside of this zone of indifference, something that directly violates their ethical principles, their norms, and their values, that's when you're going to get a lot of pushback from that employee. That's when that employee is going to refuse to provide those contributions to the leader and to the organization. So these zones of indifference will differ depending upon individual employee. And again, it is important for leaders and managers to know the different zones of indifference among their employees and endeavor not to then violate those zones of indifference. So the basic moral of the story here is you need to know your employees. Employees are not replaceable cogs in the machinery. They are unique human beings, and you have to know who they are and what they value in order to extract contributions from them to contribute to the effectiveness and efficiency of the organization. Then another human relations theorist that you have probably heard about before, especially if you've taken courses in psychology before, is Elton Mayo. Elton Mayo is most famous for a lot of the different studies that he did, but probably his most famous study is the Hawthorne experiment. And so in this Hawthorne experiment, what Elton Mayo did is he went to the Hawthorne electrical plant and he wanted to see what is the impact of altering a physical stimulus on the work productivity of employees. So if we change this external stimulus, what impact will that have on their productivity? His ultimate goal was trying to make organizations more productive, more effective, and more efficient, as was the ultimate goal of the classical theorists as well as the human relations theorists. So he goes to this Hawthorne electrical plant and he decides the physical stimulus he's going to alter is the lighting level in the factory. First hypothesis is if I turn the lighting level up, people will be able to see better, and so therefore they'll be more productive. They turn up the lighting level, people become more productive. Check off that hypothesis is confirmed. The second hypothesis is, well, let's try the opposite. If we turn the lighting level down, we would hypothesize that productivity work will go down because people cannot see as well because the lights are dimmer. They turn the lights down, productivity went up again, even higher than it went up when they turned the lights up. What he recognized is that it wasn't really the lighting level that was affecting productivity. It was the fact that the researchers were paying attention to the employees. They were talking to the employees. They were asking the employees their opinions about their jobs, what they liked about their jobs, what they didn't like about their jobs, what incentivized them, what did not incentivize them. And by paying attention to these individual employees and treating them as human beings, it was that social aspect that was actually increasing productivity. He and his colleagues also put people into groups. And they said, we see how people work in groups. And they found that group productivity usually exceeded individual productivity. And we know that sometimes group productivity is higher because of the collective expertise and knowledge, skills, and abilities of a group of people can exceed the knowledge, skills, and abilities of one individual person. But we also know that there are social pressures. So that one member of the group is not working hard enough and is making the rest of the group look bad, then the other members of the group will then place pressure on that person to be more productive so the group can look better. And so this again underscores the social aspect of organizations. Organizations are not just technical, they are also social environments. And if we don't pay attention to the social aspect of organizations, we will not be able to make our organizations as efficient and effective as they can be. So taken together, you can kind of see these human relations theorists all start to look at the unique individual natures of individual employees and also the social aspect of organizations, saying that it's just not just about you tell someone to do something and they do it, you have to gain their compliance. For Mary Parker Fall, you gain their compliance through participation. For Chester Barnard, you gain their compliance by providing them with the right set of incentives. For Elton Mayo, you gain their compliance by appealing to their social needs and treating them as social creatures, as human beings. But the ultimate goal of the human relations theorist was still the effectiveness and efficiency of the organization. It was still a macro level outcome. We were just trying to essentially manipulate employees in order to get them to make our organizations more effective and more efficient. So while there are differences between the human relations and the classical school, the one thing that ties the two schools together, the focus on what is in the best interest of the organization as opposed to the best interests of the individual employee. That was a problem that was identified by the next group of theorists, the human resource management theorists. So as we move in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, we have these human resource management theorists who are troubled by the focus on the organization of the classical and human relations theorists. Human resource management theorists felt that even though human relations was an improvement on the classical school, these human relations theorists were still exploiting workers to just get the effort they could out of those workers to benefit the organization. They weren't worried about benefiting employees, they were worried about benefiting the organization. Human resource management theorists part company with the HR theorists in their belief that it's not just what can the individual employee give to the organization, but also what can the organization give back to the employee. So now in human resource management theory, it becomes this two-way street. They kind of take that old saying from John F. Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Ask not just what individual employees can do for their organizations, but ask what organizations can do for their employees. So now in human resource management theory, we're not just focusing on the effectiveness of the organization, we are focusing on helping our individual employees develop as human resources, helping them develop their skills and their capabilities so that they can develop as human resources. And even if they take these skills and these capabilities to other organizations, that is okay, because we have at least benefited those individuals and we have improved their lives and improved their futures, even if it doesn't, in a long-term nature, benefit the organization. So the organizations now need to think about their individual employees and what they can do to help their individual employees. So now there is inherent worth within those individual employees themselves. Three of the authors that we typically look at in human resource management theory here in this class, and you look at a lot more of them once you get to 660, Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, and Chris Argyris. Abraham Maslow comes to us from the world of psychology. And you've probably heard about Abraham Maslow before and his hierarchy of needs. And you see this hierarchy of needs on the right side of the screen there. Every individual employee has needs. They are then motivated by these needs. Your bottom needs such as physiological needs, so needs such as food and clothing and water. Those physiological needs are what we call a deficit need. People are motivated by a lack of those needs. So if you don't have food, you don't have enough water, you are motivated to get enough food and get enough water. The next level of needs he has in his hierarchy are safety needs. People need to feel safe and secure from physical harm. If you feel that you are not safe and secure, you'll be motivated to try and be more safe and secure. So you're motivated by a deficiency in your safety needs. Next level up are belonging needs. You need to feel that you belong to something. You belong to a family. You belong to a group. You belong to friends. You belong to an organization. This is your more social belonging type of needs. Again, you are motivated if you don't feel you belong. You're motivated to take actions to feel more of a sense of belonging. Next level up are your esteem needs. You need to feel that you are held in high esteem by your colleagues, your friends, your family members. Again, this very psychological type of need. This is also a deficiency need that you will work toward being held in high esteem if you do not feel that you're held in that esteem already. So those bottom four needs, esteem, belonging, safety, and physiological, those are referred to as the deficit needs. So employees are motivated by having a deficit in those needs. Once that deficit has been fulfilled, it then ceases to become a motivator. So once you have all the food and water and clothing you need, you're no longer motivated by that. At the top, at the apex of this hierarchy, you have what he calls self-actualization. Self-actualization is essentially becoming all that you can be, being all that you can be, achieving your utmost potential as a human being. That's what he calls self-actualization. That he refers to as sometimes called a being or a growth need. This is an unending need. You are always motivated by the desire to grow and to self-actualize. So this is a need that does not go away. Well, so what? The importance of Abraham Maslow. Every employee may have a different ordering to their hierarchy of needs. And it's incumbent upon leaders and managers to know their individual employees, to know their ordering of needs so that you can appeal to the right need in order to motivate that employee. And hopefully it's up to the organization to fill all those deficiency needs. And then through professional development and developing people as human resources to work on that self-actualization need, to help people grow and be all they can be and achieve their utmost potential. Now, that's kind of the Abraham Maslow hierarchy of needs throughout most of his career. At the end of his career, at the end of his life, he kind of made some adjustments to this hierarchy of needs. And the primary adjustment he made was to self-actualization. He replaced self-actualization in his new and updated hierarchy of needs with more of a what you are giving back to your community. And so what have you contributed to society and to community and to those around you? So later in his life, he said the real growth is not just to be all that you can be as an individual, but to try and make your community as much as it can be as well, and to leave a legacy for your community and for your friends and for your family. And that was kind of the way in which he adjusted that hierarchy of needs at the end of his career. A big believer in Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs was Douglas McGregor. Douglas McGregor took this hierarchy of needs and used it to develop his theory X and theory Y. Ardress makes the argument that theory X says that you view individual employees very much like the classical theorists viewed employees. Individuals are lazy, they don't want to work, they're not terribly intelligent, they're not terribly creative and innovative. They don't seek out responsibility. Those are what he calls theory X types of employees. Theory Y employees are just the opposite. Theory Y employees are those employees who are motivated to work. They're intelligent, they are creative, they are innovative, and they really seek out responsibility and accountability. Those are your theory Y employees. Well, so what? According to McGregor, the majority of our employees are theory Y employees. He will admit that there are a few quote unquote clunkers. So in every organization, you've got some theory Xers, but the vast majority of your employees are going to be theory Y employees. The problem is that the majority of your organizations are classical theory X organizations. So we are taking these theory Y employees, these very ambitious, very intelligent, very creative people, and we are shoehorning them into a classical theory X organization that is much like a Max Weber or a Frederick Taylor, very top down, not allowing individual employees a lot of flexibility, not really caring about those individual employees. And so, according to McGregor, it's the job of the organization to transform itself from a theory X into a theory Y organization. How an organization does that is they do that through some of Mary Parker Follett's principles of participation and self-governance and determination through the use of this approach known as job enrichment. So according to Douglas McGregor, organizations through job enrichment will allow employees to participate in the redesigning of their jobs. So they'll be able to sit down with HR and they'll be able to tell HR, here are the types of skills that I want to develop because this is where I want to be in 5 or 10 years. You know, a lot of cities will do this with employees, and they'll sit down with an employee, and the employee will say, I want to be a city manager in 10 years. So they'll sit down with that as the employee and say, well, to become a city manager, here are some of the skills that you are going to need to develop to become a city manager. And so sometimes what they'll do is they'll incorporate within their position description the ability to kind of circulate between different departments in the city. So, well, we can give you the opportunity to work in the Department of Parks and Rec and the Department of Public Works and the Department of Community Engagement, the Department of Public Safety, so that you can kind of get a sense of all the jobs going on in the city that will then equip you with the skills that you need to eventually become a city manager. That's what we call job enrichment. And the employee gets to participate in the enrichment of their jobs. That's one primary strategy, according to McGregor, where you can take a theory X organization and transform it into a theory Y organization. Then the third person on your screen there, our third human resource management theorist, is Chris Ardress. Chris Ardress was a direct student of Douglas McGregor. So he built his theories directly on Douglas McGregor. And the primary theory that Chris Ardress is best known for is his personal growth theory. And what Chris Ardress argues is that people may not always be theory Y employees, but they become more theory Y as they go through a maturation process. He says employees go through this maturation process, this kind of personal growth arc, where they develop more self-awareness, they develop more emotional maturity, they develop more of a desire to give back to their communities. They develop more of a long-range perspective where they're interested in 20 or 30 years down the road as opposed to tomorrow or the day after that. All of that is part of this personal growth arc, this journey that people go through. According to Ardress, as people become more theory Y, it's up to the organization to help them through this personal growth process. You know, one of the things that people do in their personal growth journey is they aspire to superordinate positions. They aspire to supervisory positions. So it is then incumbent on the organization to provide those opportunities to develop skills through professional development so that they can move up through the organization and they can move up to these supervisory types of positions. So the organization has a responsibility to help people make it through this personal growth journey of moving from theory X to a theory Y type of individual. So with human resource management theory, you can see the big difference between this set of theories and human relations. In human resource management theory, it's not all about the organization. Now we have a micro level approach as well, where we are focusing on the well-being and the development of employees. So it's not just about what employees can give to the organization, but how can the organization help employees develop as human resources? So it really becomes very much this two-way street in human resource management theory. And with human resource management theory for a time frame, we're talking 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. There's still a lot of human resource management writing that's going on today. So you can really kind of think of human resource management theory as also being a contemporary modern theory. Another school of thought, if I can get my cursor to show up, another school of thought is what's known as the system school. Now, even though there are big differences between human resource management theory and human relations theory and classical theories, one thing that tied all those schools of thought together is they kind of had a focus internal to the organization. Systems theory starts to push our focus beyond the walls of the organization. It recommends that we start looking at the relationship between the organization and its external environment. And we spent time talking earlier on in this semester about the external environment of public administration. So we know that public administrators and public organizations serve many masters. We know that they serve many masters through separation of powers as well as through our system of American federalism. We also know that organizations work within these collaborative networks. We know that organizations are reliant upon their environment for providing them with resources such as qualified employees in a labor force, with money through appropriations and grant proceeds, with political support, with citizen support. Those are all resources that you get from your external environment. And so now in systems theory, we start looking at the relationship between an organization and its environment. Whole idea here being to understand, to study and understand a public organization, we must first understand the environment, the system in which that organization operates. There are kind of two approaches here in the systems school. There's what's called closed natural systems, and then there's open systems. Closed natural systems theorists look at public organizations as kind of living organisms. So they make the argument that just like a living organism, from the time an organization is created, that organization will start to go through a decaying process whereby that organization will dissipate energy out into its environment until eventually the point in time where it has dissipated so much energy that that organization no longer has the energy and the resources to survive, and that's when that agency will go out of existence. That process of dissipating energy and resources out into the environment is a process known as the process of entropy. Closed natural systems theorists will argue that all organizations, just like all living organisms, will go through this entropy process until the point in time where they decay and then go out of existence. The ultimate goal of systems theory is that these organizations will try and find a balance, an internal balance. So kind of like with the human body is seen to be healthy when it has a normal blood pressure, when it has, normal pulse ox, when it has is devoid of diseases. That's kind of when the human body is seen as being in balance, is seen as being a healthy human being. Similar type of thing with organizations. So organizations will have this organizational harmony. So when everyone is getting along, when everyone respects everyone else, when people are in alignment with the mission of the organization, where they share the values and the goals and the objectives of the organization, that's this point of organizational harmony. That is this kind of perfect balance that the organization is in. When organizations can find that perfect internal balance, that's when organizations tend to be the most effective and most efficient. That seeking of that balance is what's known as their point of homeostasis. So we're borrowing some language from the social sciences here. That's when an organization finds its point of homeostasis. And that's the ultimate goal for organizations, to find this perfect balance, this homeostasis. For closed natural systems theorists, that perfect balance is internal to the organization. It's a state of organizational harmony. However, there's another approach to systems theory known as open systems theory. Open systems theory looks beyond the walls of the organization. It also is looking to achieve this point of homeostasis, this perfect balance, but here it's a balance between the organization and its external environment. Where open systems theory parts company with closed natural systems theory is that open systems theory, the theorists do not always believe that organizations go through this entropy process and eventually go out of existence. They believe in this process known as negative entropy, meaning that yes, organizations, as they age and mature, will dissipate energy and resources into the external environment. However, organizations can also import new energy and new resources from the system as well. So as I said before, bringing in high quality, very qualified applicants into the organization who will bring new ways of thinking and new approaches in the organization, bringing in new sources of funding, bringing in more political support from policymakers. All those things are energies, all those things are resources that can be imported into the organization through this process known as negative entropy. So organization can replace the energies that they lose with these new energies they import from their external environment. But they are still trying to find this balance with their external environment. They're still trying to find this point of homeostasis. Another 25-cent word for you tonight is the word equifinality. Equifinality in open systems theory says that there are multiple paths that organizations can take toward finding this perfect balance between the organization and the external environment. There are a lot of ways in which organizations can find this point of homeostasis. They can find this balance through seeking out political support, or they can find it by finding more sources of money, more monetary revenue, or they could do it by finding the right types of employees, the right types of skills, maybe new leaders to bring into the organization. So there are a lot of different ways in which they can find this point of homeostasis, this balance between the organization and the external environment. The so what question here that we love to ask is, well, so what? What's the big deal about systems theory? The big deal about systems theory is that it's a broader, more expansive way of studying organizations. Now you're not just looking at the organization, you're looking at the system in which that organization operates. An organization is part of a whole. It is part of a system. So to study the organization, we now have to study the system that that organization operates and exists within. These systems are not permanent. Systems are very dynamic. They're very transient. They can change over time. A system may look one way one year and then look completely different another year. You may have an intervening election that then brings a new administration. That new administration can completely upend the system and make the system completely different than it was under the previous administration. So these systems do not have permanent existence. They're very dynamic and they're very changing. That adds to the complexity of studying public administration. It also then really recommends to us that answer of it depends, because studying an organization depends upon the system in which that organization is located. Now, systems theory really started to grow up in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. A lot of our approaches to studying organizations are still predicated upon understanding the role of the organization within the bigger environment, the bigger system in which it operates. And then because we have a very limited scope in this class, because we are an introductory survey-oriented class, I'm not going to take you through a lot of the more modern theories. When you get to PPA 660, you'll talk about things like quality management. You'll talk about things like leadership theories. You'll talk about some of those more modern theories. But just for the purposes of time, the one modern theory that I really do want to hone in on for our discussion tonight is a school of thought known as the organization culture school. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I think organization culture approach really does epitomize the way in which we study public organizations today. And it's really our contemporary approach to how we study public administration. The idea behind organization culture school and organization culture really started to take off in the 80s, 90s. And again, it's very much a modern theory that's alive and well today. is that organization culture argues that every public organization has its own different, unique culture. So my question to you is define culture for me. What is a culture? What do we mean by culture? And we oftentimes like to say we have a political culture in this country, and our political culture is different than the political culture in England or the political culture in France. But what is a culture?
I feel like it's like beliefs and values
Mhm.
and like behaviors of
Mhm.
people.
Sure, absolutely. It's the values, it's the expected behaviors. Kelly, go ahead.
I just like was saying, it's our values, it's what drives us, it's what motivates us, it's our upbringing. I think that's a big thing about our culture. It's our upbringing. It's kind of what is our decision making too. I think that's a big thing. Like that's something that I bring into a lot of things, decision making.
Absolutely. That's perfect. It's our expectations. It's how we make decisions. And you're right, in terms of upbringing, socialization, we learn political culture through our political socialization process. And if you've taken political science courses before, you know that there are several different sources of political socialization, whether it be parents and family, friends, schools. Those are all socialization forces that then kind of teach us about our political culture. And our political culture are a set of shared expectations, norms, and values. Organizations have that same type of set of norms and expectations and values as well. And different organizations will have different sets of norms and values and expectations. And so when we have different organizations having different cultures, in order to study those organizations and to learn how to make those organizations as effective as possible, we need to first understand the unique culture in that organization. So when we study organization cultures, we kind of study them in somewhat of a similar way as if you want to study the culture of an ancient society. So you want to study the culture of an ancient society, you're probably going to go off on an archaeological dig. And in that archaeological dig, what you're going to do is you're going to dig up maybe eating utensils. And those eating utensils will then give you some insight into how that ancient culture operated on a daily basis. And so those things that you dig up, those eating utensils, those are what we call artifacts. Those artifacts are very tangible things that we can look at and analyze to gain insight into culture of an ancient society. Organizations create artifacts as well. Organizations create artifacts such as meeting agendas, the minutes from meetings, policy and procedure manuals, rules and regulations. Those are all the tangible artifacts that are created by an organization. So we can study those in order to see what that organization believed in, how that organization operated, how egalitarian that organization is in terms of decision making, what is important to that organization. Those are all things that we can learn and get insight into that organization's culture. Every year, I go out and do accreditation site visits for our accrediting body, NASFA. And one of the things that we ask MPA programs to do is to provide us with a sample of their meeting agendas and their meeting minutes over the past 2 or 3 years, because we want to see, are these faculty members meeting on a frequent basis? Is everyone attending those meetings? Are they all part of this nucleus faculty that's making programmatic decisions? What types of issues are they grappling with? Because those are going to be the items on that agenda. And so that really gives us those artifacts to give that tangible insight. So that's one way to study culture. Another way to study culture is by studying what we call the espoused values of that organization. So organizations will have a mission statement, and the mission statement will say, this is who we are as an organization, this is what we do, this is what we believe in. So if we're an MPA program, we exist to, and I shared our mission statement with you on our very first night of class. We want to recruit and educate a diverse student body with the skills necessary to be effective managed leaders and managers in public and nonprofit sectors and so on and so on. That's who we are. That's our mission statement. Organizations will oftentimes have vision statements as well. The vision statement is kind of, this is who we want to be when we grow up. So this is how we envision the organization maybe in 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. So we want to be the premier graduate public affairs program in the Western United States. That's kind of our vision. Those are kind of those espoused values. Those espoused values can also be things such as, our code of conduct and our code of ethics, our strategic plans, where we'll lay out, here are our goals and our objectives, what we're trying to achieve. They're values that are espoused. The organization's telling you, these are our values, this is what we believe in. On that first night of class, I shared with you all the public sector values that underpin our mission statement as an MPA program. So those are what the organization tells you. This is what we believe in. These are our espoused values. So those are also relatively easy to see and to study. What's more difficult to see and study are the basic assumptions. So every organization will have basic assumptions. These are assumptions that everyone in the organization shares, but they don't really talk a lot about them. So things such as, we expect that we will treat each other professionally and in a collegial manner. Now, unless you have a civility code, which some organizations have had to adopt, our college has had to adopt one of those. But unless you have that civility code, you're probably not going to go out there and say, to the entire world, this is what we expect. These are just basic assumptions that are kind of unspoken that everyone shares. Those basic assumptions are more difficult to study because, again, they're not spoken. And so they're kind of harder to get at. They're a much deeper, much more buried level of organization culture. Artifacts are the easiest ones to get, followed by espoused values, and then basic assumptions are much more difficult to study. Leaders, when they come into organizations, have the ability to embed certain cultures into their organizations. And when you get to 660 and talk about organization culture again, you'll talk about some of the primary and secondary embedding strategies that leaders can use to embed culture into their organizations. But things such as using slogans. And so a leader comes in and says, together we can achieve more. That's a slogan. That slogan then appears on all the stationery and all the business cards and all the taglines of all the emails. That's a way to embed culture. What leaders pay attention to and what leaders reward and what leaders sanction can also embed culture. So if employees see, well, this behavior was rewarded, this person got employee of the week or employee of the month by exhibiting this behavior, this is something that the leader and the organization place a value on. So this is probably something I might want to think about actually engaging in that behavior. Or if someone gets sanctioned and disciplined for a behavior, that's a behavior I want to try and stay away from. And so there are really dozens of ways in which leaders can embed cultures into their organizations. The so what question here is for our discussion is, if every organization has its own unique organization culture, we no longer have the ability to use a one-size-fits-all approach to apply to all of our organizations. We have to really dig into those individual organizations, really dig into those individual cultures, understand the organization culture before we can learn how to reform that organization and make that organization more effective and efficient. So that's kind of a very quick overview of about 150 years of the literature in public administration. And again, because we focus primarily on public organizations, our literature in the discipline really does focus primarily on how we study public organizations and our theories and how to make those organizations more effective. As I said, the primary thread, the current that undercuts all of this, and it really underpins all of this 150-year discussion of the evolution of our literature, has been this movement away from finding the one-size-fits-all approach and moving more toward a contextual, it depends type of approach. We have to know the uniqueness of the organization, know where that organization resides within its system, within its environment, know the unique employees and their motivations and their needs for self-actualization who work within our organizations. We have to really take that much more nuanced, much more complex approach to studying public administration. That is why if you take a look at journal articles in public administration, so just get copies of Public Administration Review. and look at articles that were written in the 1950s and the 1960s and compare them to articles written this year, you'll see that the methodologies that we use to study public administration, those methodologies have become far more sophisticated than they used to be. We are far more quantitative than we used to be. We rely a lot more on advanced statistics because it has become such a complex field. We then have to apply these complex methods in order to study those complex phenomena. Now, if you haven't guessed it already, where we are now and where we are going in the future of this class over the next couple of weeks is we are now starting to introduce the functions of public administration. And we're going to start kind of giving you some insight into some of those core courses that you are going to be taking as you move throughout the MPA program. So our discussion tonight of organization theory is obviously kind of a precursor to PPA 660, your organization theory and behavior class. In 660, you will get into a lot more detail in terms of this evolution of the organization theory literature, and you'll talk about a lot of additional authors. Next week, when we get together, we are going to continue this discussion of the functions of leading and managing public organizations, when we'll get into a discussion of what administrators do when they implement and execute public policies and public programs. So we'll start next week with a discussion of public policy analysis, what we do in public administration in implementing, formulating, implementing, and executing public policies. We'll talk about the decision-making types of things that we do in making decisions about policies. And then we'll talk about implementing public programs. We'll talk about the differences between policies and programs and what administrators do in the implementation and evaluation of programs. Next week, when we talk about policy, we're talking about 670 policy analysis. When we talk about programs, we're talking about 696 research methods, which is really program evaluation. From there, we will then move into other functions of public administration, how we lead and manage personnel, human resource management, which will then give you some insight into PPA 577, human resource management. And then we'll wrap up the entire show on our last night together with the management of fiscal resources. And that will then be a precursor into your PPA 555, public budgeting and finance. So from here on out, we're looking at the functions of public administration and kind of going through kind of a little foreshadowing, if you will, of some of those core courses that you'll be taking later on in the program. So based upon our information tonight in terms of talking about the discipline of public administration, as well as the development of the literature in public administration in terms of public organization theory literature, do you have any questions or any clarifications needed on any of this information? I know we covered a lot of information tonight. One of the complicating things about a class like this is it is an introductory survey-oriented class, so there's only so much detail we can get in. But we really do want to, the whole purpose of the course is really to equip you with the skills and the information that you need to then be successful in the remainder of the MPA program. So this truly is just an introduction into the field of public administration. Well, that's as far as we're going to go tonight. I don't want to go into any new information because we only have half an hour left. I think we can have plenty of time over the next 2 class sessions to cover all the information that we normally cover in this course. So we'll stop it there tonight. Again, this recording, if I do my job right this time, it will be available on our Canvas site, hopefully by tomorrow morning. And then if you have any questions about the midterm assessment as you work on it, please send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Again, be as concise and parsimonious as you can in your answers. 1 to 2 paragraphs for each question will certainly be good enough to suffice. Okay. All right. Hope everyone has a great evening. Hope everyone has a great week. And I'll talk to you again at 4 o'clock next Tuesday. So take care, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure.
Quick, I wanted to talk to you about the discussions. Am I late? I did do the responses.
Okay. I'll go back and I'll assign full credit to it. So don't worry about that.
I just wanted to inform you. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks, Kelly.